This is a continuation of O Pioneers by Willa Cather, comprising Part 2, Chapters 7 through 12 and Part 3, Chapter 1. Part 2, Chapter 7. Marie's father, Albert Tversky, was one of the more intelligent Bohemians who came west in the early 70s. He settled in Omaha and became a leader and advisor among his people there. Marie was his youngest child, by a second wife, and was the apple of his eye. She was barely 16 and was in the graduating class of the Omaha High School when Frank Shabata arrived from the old country and set all the Bohemian girls in a flutter. He was easily the buck of the beer gardens, and on Sunday he was a sight to see, with his silk hat and tucked shirt and blue frock coat, wearing gloves and carrying a little wisp of a yellow cane. He was tall and fair, with splendid teeth and close-cropped yellow curls, and he wore a slightly disdainful expression, proper for a young man with high connections whose mother had a big farm in the Elbe Valley. There was often an interesting discontent in his blue eyes, and every Bohemian girl he met imagined herself the cause of that unsatisfied expression. He had a way of drawing out his cambric handkerchief slowly by one corner from his breast pocket that was melancholy and romantic in the extreme. He took a little flight with each of the more eligible Bohemian girls, but it was when he was with little Marie Tversky that he drew his handkerchief out most slowly, and after he had lit a fresh cigar, dropped the match most despairingly. Anyone could see with half an eye that his proud heart was bleeding for somebody. One Sunday, late in the summer after Marie's graduation, she met Frank at a Bohemian picnic down the river, and went rowing with him all the afternoon. When she got home that evening, she went straight to her father's room and told him that she was engaged to Shabata. Old Tversky was having a comfortable pipe before he went to bed. When he heard his daughter's announcement, he first prudently corked his beer bottle and then leaped to his feet and had a turn of temper. He characterized Frank Shabata by a Bohemian expression which is the equivalent of stuffed shirt. Why don't he go to work like the rest of us did? His farm in the Elbe Valley, indeed. Ain't he got plenty brothers and sisters? It's his mother's farm. And why don't he stay at home and help her? Haven't I seen his mother out in the morning at 5 o'clock with her ladle and her big bucket on wheels, putting liquid manure on the cabbages? Don't I know the look of old Eva Shabata's hands, like an old horse's hoofs they are, and this fellow wearing gloves and rings? Engaged, indeed. You aren't fit to be out of school, and that's what's the matter with you. I will send you off to the Sisters of the Sacred Heart in St. Louis, and they will teach you some sense, I guess. Accordingly, the very next week, Albert Tversky took his daughter, pale and tearful, down the river to the convent. But the way to make Frank want anything was to tell him he couldn't have it. He managed to have an interview with Marie before she went away, and whereas he had been only half in love with her before, he now persuaded himself that he would not stop at anything. Marie took with her to the convent, under the canvas lining of her trunk, the results of a laborious and satisfying morning on Frank's part. No less than a dozen photographs of himself, taken in a dozen different love-lorn attitudes. There was a little round photograph for her watch case, photographs for her wall and dresser, and even long, narrow ones to be used as bookmarks. More than once the handsome gentleman was torn to pieces before the French class by an indignant nun. Marie pined in the convent for a year, until her 18th birthday was passed. Then she met Frank Shabata in the Union Station in St. Louis and ran away with him. Old Tversky forgave his daughter, because there was nothing else to do, and bought her a farm in the country that she had loved so well as a child. Since then her story had been a part of the history of the Divide. She and Frank had been living there for 5 years when Carl Lindstrom came back to pay his long-deferred visit to Alexandra. Frank had, on the whole, done better than one might have expected. He had flung himself at the soil with savage energy. Once a year he went to Hastings or to Omaha, on a spree. He stayed away for a week or two, and then came home and worked like a demon. He did work. If he felt sorry for himself, that was his own affair. Part 2, Chapter 8. On the evening of the day of Alexandra's call at the Shabatas, a heavy rain set in. Frank sat up until a late hour reading the Sunday newspapers. One of the Goulds was getting a divorce, and Frank took it as a personal affront. In printing the story of the young man's marital troubles, the knowing editor gave a sufficiently colored account of his career, stating the amount of his income and the manner in which he was supposed to spend it. Frank read English slowly, and the more he read about this divorce case, the angrier he grew. At last he threw down the page with a snort. He turned to his farm hand who was reading the other half of the paper. By God, if I have that young feller in de hayfield once, I show him something. Listen here what he do wid his money. And Frank began the catalogue of the young man's reputed extravagances. Marie sighed. She thought it hard that the Goulds, for whom she had nothing but goodwill, should make her so much trouble. She hated to see the Sunday newspapers come into the house. Frank was always reading about the doings of rich people and feeling outraged. He had an inexhaustible stock of stories about their crimes and follies, how they bribed the courts and shot down their butlers with impunity whenever they chose. Frank and Lou Bergson had very similar ideas, and they were two of the political agitators of the county. The next morning broke clear and brilliant, but Frank said the ground was too wet to plow, so he took the cart and drove over to St. Agnes to spend the day at Moses Marcel's saloon. After he was gone, Marie went out to the back porch to begin her butter making. A brisk wind had come up and was driving puffy white clouds across the sky. The orchard was sparkling and rippling in the sun. Marie stood looking toward it wistfully, her hand on the lid of the churn, when she heard a sharp ring in the air, the merry sound of the whetstone on the scythe. That invitation decided her. She ran into the house, put on a short skirt and a pair of her husband's boots, caught up a tin pail and started for the orchard. Emil had already begun work and was mowing vigorously. When he saw her coming, he stopped and wiped his brow. His yellow canvas leggings and khaki trousers were splashed to the knees. Don't let me disturb you, Emil. I'm going to pick cherries. Isn't everything beautiful after the rain? Oh, but I'm glad to get this place mowed. When I heard it raining in the night, I thought maybe you would come and do it for me today. The wind wakened me. Didn't it blow dreadfully? Just smell the wild roses. They are always so spicy after a rain. We never had so many of them in here before. I suppose it's the wet season. Will you have to cut them too? If I cut the grass, I will, Emil said teasingly. What's the matter with you? What makes you so flighty? Am I flighty? I suppose that's the wet season too, then. It's exciting to see everything growing so fast, and to get the grass cut. Please leave the roses till last if you must cut them. Oh, I don't mean all of them. I mean that low place down by my tree, where there are so many. Aren't you splashed? Look at the spider webs all over the grass. Goodbye. I'll call you if I see a snake. She tripped away and Emil stood looking after her. In a few moments he heard the cherries dropping smartly into the pail, and he began to swing his scythe with that long, even stroke that few American boys ever learn. Marie picked cherries and sang softly to herself, stripping one glittering branch after another, shivering when she caught a shower of raindrops on her neck and hair, and Emil mowed his way slowly down toward the cherry trees. That summer the rains had been so many and opportune that it was almost more than Shabata and his man could do to keep up with the corn. The orchard was a neglected wilderness. All sorts of weeds and herbs and flowers had grown up there, splotches of wild larkspur, pale green and white spikes of horehound, plantations of wild cotton, tangles of foxtail and wild wheat. South of the apricot trees, cornering on the wheat field, was Frank's alfalfa, where myriads of white and yellow butterflies were always fluttering above the purple blossoms. When Emil reached the lower corner by the hedge, Marie was sitting under her white mulberry tree, the pailful of cherries beside her, looking off at the gentle, tireless swelling of the wheat. Emil, she said suddenly. He was mowing quietly about under the tree, so as not to disturb her. What religion did the Swedes have away back, before they were Christians? Emil paused and straightened his back. I don't know. About like the Germans, wasn't it? Marie went on as if she had not heard him. The Bohemians, were tree worshippers before the missionaries came. Father says the people in the mountains still do queer things. Sometimes they believe that trees bring good or bad luck. Emil looked superior. Do they? Well, which are the lucky trees? I'd like to know. I don't know all of them, but I know lindens are. The old people in the mountains plant lindens to purify the forest, and to do away with the spells that come from the old trees they say have lasted from heathen times. I'm a good Catholic, but I think I could get along with caring for trees if I hadn't anything else. That's a poor saying, said Emil, stooping over to wipe his hands in the wet grass. Why is it? If I feel that way, I feel that way. I like trees because they seem more resigned to the way they have to live than other things do. I feel as if this tree knows everything I ever think of when I sit here. When I come back to it, I never have to remind it of anything. I begin just where I left off. Emil had nothing to say to this. He reached up among the branches and began to pick the sweet, insipid fruit, long ivory-colored berries, tipped with faint pink, like white coral, that fall to the ground unheeded all summer through. He dropped a handful into her lap. "Do you like Mr. Lindstrom?" Marie asked suddenly. "Yes, don't you?" "Oh, ever so much, only he seems kind of stayed in school teachery. But of course he is older than Frank even. I'm sure I don't want to live to be more than 30, do you?" "Do you think Alexandra likes him very much?" "I suppose so. They were old friends." "Oh, Emile, you know what I mean." Marie tossed her head impatiently. "Does she really care about him?" "When she used to tell me about him, I always wondered whether she wasn't a little in love with him." "Who, Alexandra?" Emile laughed and thrust his hands into his trousers pockets. "Alexandra's never been in love. You crazy." He laughed again. "She wouldn't know how to go about it. The idea." Marie shrugged her shoulders. "Oh, you don't know Alexandra as well as you think you do. If you had any eyes, you would see that she is very fond of him. It would serve you all right if she walked off with Carl. I like him because he appreciates her more than you do." Emil frowned. "What are you talking about, Marie? Alexandra's all right. She and I have always been good friends. What more do you want? I like to talk to Carl about New York and what a fellow can do there." "Oh, Emile, surely you are not thinking of going off there." "Why not? I must go somewhere, mustn't I?" The young man took up his scythe and leaned on it. "Would you rather I went off in the sand hills and lived like Ivar?" Marie's face fell under his brooding gaze. She looked down at his wet leggings. "I'm sure Alexandra hopes you'll well stay on here," she murmured. "Then Alexandra will be disappointed," the young man said roughly. "What do I want to hang around here for? Alexandra can run the farm all right without me. I don't want to stand around and look on. I want to be doing something on my own account." "That's so," Marie sighed. "There are so many things you can do, almost anything you choose." "And there are so many things I can't do." Emile echoed her tone sarcastically. "Sometimes I don't want to do anything at all, and sometimes I want to pull the four corners of the divide together." He threw out his arm and brought it back with a jerk, so like a tablecloth. "I get tired of seeing men and horses going up and down, up and down." Marie looked up at his defiant figure, and her face clouded. "I wish you weren't so restless, and didn't get so worked up over things," she said sadly. "Thank you," he returned shortly. She sighed despondently. "Everything I say makes you cross, don't it? And you never used to be cross to me." Emil took a step nearer and stood frowning down at her bent head. He stood in an attitude of self-defense, his feet well apart, his hands clenched and drawn up at his sides so that the cord stood out on his bare arms. "I can't play with you like a little boy anymore," he said slowly. "That's what you miss, Marie. You'll have to get some other little boy to play with." He stopped and took a deep breath. Then he went on in a low tone so intense that it was almost threatening. "Sometimes you seem to understand perfectly, and then sometimes you pretend you don't. You don't help things any by pretending. It's then that I want to pull the corners of the divide together. If you won't understand, you know I could make you." Marie clasped her hands and started up from her seat. She had grown very pale and her eyes were shining with excitement and distress. "But, Emile, if I understand, then all our good times are over. We can never do nice things together anymore. We shall have to behave like Mr. Lindstrom. And anyhow, there's nothing to understand." She struck the ground with her little foot fiercely. "That won't last. It will go away, and things will be just as they used to. I wish you were a Catholic. The church helps people, indeed it does. I pray for you, but that's not the same as if you prayed yourself." She spoke rapidly and pleadingly, looked entreatingly into his face. Emile stood defiant, gazing down at her. "I can't pray to have the things I want," he said slowly, "and I won't pray not to have them, not if I'm damned for it." Marie turned away, wringing her hands. "Oh, Emile, you won't try. Then all our good times are over." "Yes, over. I never expect to have any more." Emile gripped the handholds of his scythe and began to mow. Marie took up her cherries and went slowly toward the house, crying bitterly. Part 2, Chapter 9. On Sunday afternoon, a month after Carl Lindstrom's arrival, he rode with Emile up into the French country to attend a Catholic fair. He sat for most of the afternoon in the basement of the church, where the fair was held, talking to Marie Shabata, or strolled about the gravel terrace, thrown up on the hillside in front of the basement doors, where the French boys were jumping and wrestling and throwing the discus. Some of the boys were in their white baseball suits. They had just come up from a Sunday practice game down in the ball grounds. Amédée, the newly married Émile's best friend, was their pitcher, renowned among the country towns for his dash and skill. Amédée was a little fellow, a year younger than Émile and much more boyish in appearance, very lithe and active and neatly made, with a clear brown and white skin and flashing white teeth. The Sainte Agnes boys were to play the Hastings 9 in a fortnight, and Amédée's lightning balls were the hope of his team. The little Frenchman seemed to get every ounce there was in him behind the ball as it left his hand. "You'd have made the battery at the university for sure, Amédée," Émile said as they were walking from the ball grounds back to the church on the hill. "You're pitching better than you did in the spring." Amédée grinned. "Sure. A married man don't lose his head no more." He slapped Émile on the back as he caught step with him. "Oh, Émile, you want to get married right off quick. It's the greatest thing ever." Émile laughed. "How am I going to get married without any girl?" Amédée took his arm. "Pooh. There are plenty girls will have you. You want to get some nice French girl now. She treat you well. Always be jolly. See," he began checking off on his fingers, "there is Séverine, and Alphonsine, and Josephine, and Hectorine, and Louise, and Malvina. Why, I could love any of them girls. Why don't you get after them? Are you stuck up, Émile, or is anything the matter with you? I never did know a boy 22 years old before that didn't have no girl. You want to be a priest, maybe?" "Not a for me," Amédée swaggered. "I bring many good Catholics into this world, I hope, and that's a way I help the church." Émile looked down and patted him on the shoulder. "Now you're windy, Amédée. You Frenchies like to brag." But Amédée had the zeal of the newly married, and he was not to be lightly shaken off. "Honest and true, Émile, don't you want any girl? Maybe there's some young lady in Lincoln, now, very grand." Amédée waved his hand languidly before his face to denote the fan of heartless beauty. "And you lost your heart up there. Is that it?" "Maybe," said Émile. But Amédée saw no appropriate glow in his friend's face. "Bah!" he exclaimed in disgust. "I tell all the French girls to keep away from you. You got a rock in there," thumping Émile on the ribs. When they reached the terrace at the side of the church, Amédée, who was excited by his success on the ball grounds, challenged Émile to a jumping match, though he knew he would be beaten. They belted themselves up, and Raoul Marcel, the choir tenor and Father Duchesne's pet, and Jean Bourdelau held the string over which they vaulted. All the French boys stood round, cheering and humping themselves up when Émile or Amédée went over the wire, as if they were helping in the lift. Émile stopped at 5'5", declaring that he would spoil his appetite for supper if he jumped any more. Angelique, Amédée's pretty bride, as blonde and fair as her name, who had come out to watch the match, tossed her head at Émile and said, "Amédée could jump much higher than you if he were as tall, and anyhow he is much more graceful. He goes over like a bird, and you have to hump yourself all up." "Oh, I do I?" Émile caught her and kissed her saucy mouth squarely, while she laughed and struggled and called, "Amédée, Amédée." "There, you see, your Amédée isn't even big enough to get you away from me. I could run away with you right now, and he could only sit down and cry about it. I'll show you whether I have to hump myself." Laughing and panting, he picked Angelique up in his arms and began running about the rectangle with her. Not until he saw Marie Chabot's tiger eyes flashing from the gloom of the basement doorway did he hand the disheveled bride over to her husband. "There, go to your graceful. I haven't the heart to take you away from him." Angelique clung to her husband and made faces at Émile over the white shoulder of Amédée's ball shirt. Émile was greatly amused at her air of proprietorship and at Amédée's shameless submission to it. He was delighted with his friend's good fortune. He liked to see and to think about Amédée's sunny, natural, happy love. He and Amédée had ridden and wrestled and larked together since they were lads of 12. On Sundays and holidays they were always arm in arm. It seemed strange that now he should have to hide the thing that Amédée was so proud of, that the feeling which gave one of them such happiness should bring the other such despair. It was like that when Alexandra tested her seed corn in the spring, he mused. From 2 ears that had grown side by side, the grains of one shot up joyfully into the light, projecting themselves into the future, and the grains from the other lay still in the earth and rotted, and nobody knew why. Part 2, Chapter 10. While Émile and Carl were amusing themselves at the fair, Alexandra was at home, busy with her account books, which had been neglected of late. She was almost through with her figures when she heard a cart drive up to the gate, and looking out of the window she saw her two older brothers. They had seemed to avoid her ever since Carl Lindstrom's arrival 4 weeks ago that day, and she hurried to the door to welcome them. She saw at once that they had come with some very definite purpose. They followed her stiffly into the sitting room. Oscar sat down, but Lou walked over to the window and remained standing, his hands behind him. "You are by yourself?" he asked, looking toward the doorway into the parlor. "Yes, Carl and Emil went up to the Catholic fair." For a few moments neither of the men spoke. Then Louisiana came out sharply. "How soon does he intend to go away from here?" "I don't know, Lou. Not for some time, I hope." Alexandra spoke in an even, quiet tone that often exasperated her brothers. They felt that she was trying to be superior with them. Oscar spoke up grimly. "We thought we ought to tell you that people have begun to talk," he said meaningly. Alexandra looked at him. "What about?" Oscar met her eyes blankly. "About you keeping him here so long. It looks bad for him to be hanging on to a woman this way. People think you're getting taken in." Alexandra shut her account book firmly. "Boys," she said seriously, "don't let's go on with this. We won't come out anywhere. I can't take advice on such a matter. I know you mean well, but you must not feel responsible for me in things of this sort. If we go on with this talk, it will only make hard feeling." Lou whipped about from the window. "You ought to think a little about your family. You're making us all ridiculous." "How am I?" "People are beginning to say you want to marry the fellow." "Well, and what is ridiculous about that?" Lou and Oscar exchanged outraged looks. "Alexandra, can't you see he's just a tramp and he's after your money? He wants to be taken care of, he does." "Well, suppose I want to take care of him? Whose business is it but my own?" "Don't you know he'd get hold of your property?" "He'd get hold of what I wished to give him, certainly." Oscar sat up suddenly and Lou clutched at his bristly hair. "Give him?" Lou shouted. "Our property, our homestead?" "I don't know about the homestead," said Alexandra quietly. "I know you and Oscar have always expected that it would be left to your children, and I'm not sure but what you're right. But I'll do exactly as I please with the rest of my land, boys." "The rest of your land," cried Lou, growing more excited every minute. "Didn't all the land come out of the homestead? It was bought with money borrowed on the homestead, and Oscar and me worked ourselves to the bone paying interest on it." "Yes, you paid the interest, but when you married we made a division of the land and you were satisfied. I've made more on my farm since I've been alone than when we all worked together." "Everything you've made has come out of the original land that us boys worked for, hasn't it? The farms and all that comes out of them belongs to us as a family." Alexandra waved her hand impatiently. "Come now, Lou. Stick to the facts. You are talking nonsense. Go to the county clerk and ask him who owns my land and whether my titles are good." Lou turned to his brother. "This is what comes of letting a woman meddle in business," he said bitterly. "We ought to have taken things in our own hands years ago, but she liked to run things, and we humored her. We thought you had good sense, Alexandra. We never thought you'd do anything foolish." Alexandra rapped impatiently on her desk with her knuckles. "Listen, Lou, don't talk wild. You say you ought to have taken things into your own hands years ago. I suppose you mean before you left home. But how could you take hold of what wasn't there? I've got most of what I have now since we divided the property. I've built it up myself, and it has nothing to do with you." Oscar spoke up solemnly. "The property of a family really belongs to the men of the family, no matter about the title. If anything goes wrong, it's the men that are held responsible." "Yes, of course," Lou broke in. "Everybody knows that. Oscar and me have always been easygoing and we've never made any fuss. We were willing you should hold the land and have the good of it, but you got no right to part with any of it. We worked in the fields to pay for the first land you bought, and whatever's come out of it has got to be kept in the family." Oscar reinforced his brother, his mind fixed on the one point he could see. The property of a family belongs to the men of the family because they are held responsible and because they do the work. Alexandra looked from one to the other, her eyes full of indignation. She had been impatient before, but now she was beginning to feel angry. "And what about my work?" she asked in an unsteady voice. Lou looked at the carpet. "Oh, now, Alexandra, you always took it pretty easy." "Of course we wanted you to. You liked to manage round, and we always humored you. We realize you were a great deal of help to us. 'There's no woman anywhere around that knows as much about business as you do, and we've always been proud of that and thought you were pretty smart. But of course the real work always fell on us. Good advice is all right, but it don't get the weeds out of the corn. Maybe not, but it sometimes puts in the crop, and it sometimes keeps the fields for corn to grow in, said Alexandra dryly. Why, Lou, I can remember when you and Oscar wanted to sell this homestead and all the improvements to old Preacher Erickson for $2,000. If I'd consented, you'd have gone down to the river and scraped along on poor farms for the rest of your lives. When I put in our first field of alfalfa, you both opposed me, just because I first heard about it from a young man who had been to the university. You said I was being taken in then, and all the neighbors said so. You know as well as I do that alfalfa has been the salvation of this country. You all laughed at me when I said our land here was about ready for wheat, and I had to raise 3 big wheat crops before the neighbors quit putting all their land in corn. Why, I remember you cried, Lou, when we put in the first big wheat planting and said everybody was laughing at us. Lou turned to Oscar. That's the woman of it. If she tells you to put in a crop, she thinks she's put it in. It makes women conceited to meddle in business. I shouldn't think you'd want to remind us how hard you were on us, Alexandra, after the way you baby Emil. Hard on you? I never meant to be hard. Conditions were hard. Maybe I would never have been very soft anyhow, but I certainly didn't choose to be the kind of girl I was. If you take even a vine and cut it back again and again, it grows hard like a tree. Lou felt that they were wandering from the point, and that in digression Alexandra might unnerve him. He wiped his forehead with a jerk of his handkerchief. We never doubted you, Alexandra. We never questioned anything you did. You've always had your own way, but you can't expect us to sit like stumps and see you done out of the property by any loafer who happens along, and making yourself ridiculous into the bargain. Oscar rose. Yes, he broke in, everybody's laughing to see you get took in at your age too. Everybody knows he's nearly 5 years younger than you, and is after your money. Why, Alexandra, you are 40 years old. All that doesn't concern anybody but Carl and me. Go to town and ask your lawyers what you can do to restrain me from disposing of my own property. And I advise you to do what they tell you, for the authority you can exert by law is the only influence you will ever have over me again. Alexandra rose. I think I would rather not have lived to find out what I have today, she said quietly, closing her desk. Lou and Oscar looked at each other questioningly. There seemed to be nothing to do but to go, and they walked out. You can't do business with women, Oscar said heavily as he clambered into the cart. But anyhow, we've had our say at last. Lou scratched his head. Talk of that kind might come too high, you know, but she's apt to be sensible. You hadn't ought to said that about her age, though, Oscar. I'm afraid that hurt her feelings, and the worst thing we can do is to make her sore at us. She'd marry him out of contrariness. I only meant, said Oscar, that she is old enough to know better, and she is. If she was going to marry, she ought to done it long ago, and not go making a fool of herself now. Lou looked anxious, nevertheless. Of course, he reflected hopefully and inconsistently, Alexandra ain't much like other women folks. Maybe it won't make her sore. Maybe she'd as soon be 40 as not. Part 2, Chapter 11. Emil came home at about 7:30 that evening. Old Ivor met him at the windmill and took his horse, and the young man went directly into the house. He called to his sister, and she answered from her bedroom, behind the sitting room, saying that she was lying down. Emil went to her door. Can I see you for a minute? He asked. I want to talk to you about something before Carl comes. Alexandra rose quickly and came to the door. Where is Carl? Lou and Oscar met us and said they wanted to talk to him, so he rode over to Oscar's with them. Are you coming out? Emil asked impatiently. Yes, sit down. I'll be dressed in a moment. Alexandra closed her door, and Emil sank down on the old slat lounge and sat with his head in his hands. When his sister came out, he looked up, not knowing whether the interval had been short or long, and he was surprised to see that the room had grown quite dark. That was just as well. It would be easier to talk if he were not under the gaze of those clear, deliberate eyes that saw so far in some directions and were so blind in others. Alexandra, too, was glad of the dusk. Her face was swollen from crying. Emil started up and then sat down again. Alexandra, he said slowly, in his deep young baritone, I don't want to go away to law school this fall. Let me put it off another year. I want to take a year off and look around. It's awfully easy to rush into a profession you don't really like, and awfully hard to get out of it. Lindstrom and I have been talking about that. Very well, Emil. Only don't go off looking for land. She came up and put her hand on his shoulder. I've been wishing you could stay with me this winter. That's just what I don't want to do, Alexandra. I'm restless. I want to go to a new place. I want to go down to the city of Mexico to join one of the university fellows who's at the head of an electrical plant. He wrote me he could give me a little job, enough to pay my way, and I could look around and see what I want to do. I want to go as soon as harvest is over. I guess Lou and Oscar will be sore about it. I suppose they will. Alexandra sat down on the lounge beside him. They are very angry with me, Emil. We have had a quarrel. They will not come here again. Emil scarcely heard what she was saying. He did not notice the sadness of her tone. He was thinking about the reckless life he meant to live in Mexico. What about? He asked absently. About Carl Lindstrom. They are afraid I am going to marry him, and that some of my property will get away from them. Emil shrugged his shoulders. What nonsense, he murmured. Just like them. Alexandra drew back. Why nonsense, Emil? Why, you've never thought of such a thing, have you? They always have to have something to fuss about. Emil, said his sister slowly, you ought not to take things for granted. Do you agree with them that I have no right to change my way of living? Emil looked at the outline of his sister's head in the dim light. They were sitting close together, and he somehow felt that she could hear his thoughts. He was silent for a moment, and then said in an embarrassed tone, Why, no, certainly not. You ought to do whatever you want to. I'll always back you. But it would seem a little bit ridiculous to you if I married Carl. Emil fidgeted. The issue seemed to him too far-fetched to warrant discussion. Why, no. I should be surprised if you wanted to. I can't see exactly why. But that's none of my business. You ought to do as you please. Certainly you ought not to pay any attention to what the boys say. Alexandra sighed. I had hoped you might understand a little why I do want to, but I suppose that's too much to expect. I've had a pretty lonely life, Emil. Besides Marie, Carl is the only friend I have ever had. Emil was awake now. A name in her last sentence roused him. He put out his hand and took his sister's awkwardly. You ought to do just as you wish, and I think Carl's a fine fellow. He and I would always get on. I don't believe any of the things the boys say about him. Honest, I don't. They are suspicious of him because he's intelligent. You know their way. They've been sore at me ever since you let me go away to college. They're always trying to catch me up. If I were you, I wouldn't pay any attention to them. There's nothing to get upset about. Carl's a sensible fellow. He won't mind them. I don't know. If they talk to him the way they did to me, I think he'll go away. Emil grew more and more uneasy. Think so? Well, Marie said it would serve us all right if you walked off with him. Did she? Bless her little heart, she would. Alexandra's voice broke. Emil began unlacing his leggings. Why don't you talk to her about it? There's Carl, I hear his horse. I guess I'll go upstairs and get my boots off. No, I don't want any supper. We had supper at 5 o'clock, at the fair. Emil was glad to escape and get to his own room. He was a little ashamed for his sister, though he had tried not to show it. He felt that there was something indecorous in her proposal, and she did seem to him somewhat ridiculous. There was trouble enough in the world, he reflected, as he threw himself upon his bed, without people who were 40 years old imagining they wanted to get married. In the darkness and silence, Emil was not likely to think long about Alexandra. Every image slipped away but one. He had seen Marie in the crowd that afternoon. She sold candy at the fair. Why had she ever run away with Frank Shibata? And how could she go on laughing and working and taking an interest in things? Why did she like so many people? And why had she seemed pleased when all the French and Bohemian boys, and the priest himself, crowded round her candy stand? Why did she care about anyone but him? Why could he never find the thing he looked for in her playful, affectionate eyes? Then he fell to imagining that he looked once more and found it there, and what it would be like if she loved him. She who, as Alexandra said, could give her whole heart. In that dream he could lie for hours as if in a trance. His spirit went out of his body and crossed the fields to Marie Shibata. At the university dances the girls had often looked wonderingly at the tall young Swede with the fine head, leaning against the wall and frowning, his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the ceiling or the floor. All the girls were a little afraid of him. He was distinguished-looking, and not the jollying kind. They felt that he was too intense and preoccupied. there was something queer about him. Emil's fraternity rather prided itself upon its dances, and sometimes he did his duty and danced every dance. But whether he was on the floor or brooding in a corner, he was always thinking about Marie Shibata. For 2 years the storm had been gathering in him. Part 2, Chapter 12. Carl came into the sitting room while Alexandra was lighting the lamp. She looked up at him as she adjusted the shade. His sharp shoulders stooped as if he were very tired, his face was pale, and there were bluish shadows under his dark eyes. His anger had burned itself out and left him sick and disgusted. "You have seen Lou and Oscar?" Alexandra asked. "Yes." His eyes avoided hers. Alexandra took a deep breath. "And now you are going away." "I thought so." Carl threw himself into a chair and pushed the dark lock back from his forehead with his white, nervous hand. "What a hopeless position you are in, Alexandra," he exclaimed feverishly. "It is your fate to be always surrounded by little men, and I am no better than the rest. I am too little to face the criticism of even such men as Lou and Oscar. Yes, I am going away tomorrow. I cannot even ask you to give me a promise until I have something to offer you. I thought perhaps I could do that, but I find I can't." "What good comes of offering people things they don't need?" Alexandra asked sadly. "I don't need money. But I have needed you for a great many years. I wonder why I have been permitted to prosper, if it is only to take my friends away from me." "I don't deceive myself," Carl said frankly. "I know that I am going away on my own account. I must make the usual effort. I must have something to show for myself. To take what you would give me, I should have to be either a very large man or a very small one, and I am only in the middle class." Alexandra sighed. "I have a feeling that if you go away, you will not come back. Something will happen to one of us, or to both. People have to snatch at happiness when they can. In this world, it is always easier to lose than to find. What I have is yours if you care enough about me to take it." Carl rose and looked up at the picture of John Bergson. "But I can't, my dear, I can't. I will go north at once. Instead of idling about in California all winter, I shall be getting my bearings up there. I won't waste another week. Be patient with me, Alexandra. Give me a year." "As you will," said Alexandra wearily. "All at once, in a single day, I lose everything, and I do not know why. Emil, too, is going away." Carl was still studying John Bergson's face, and Alexandra's eyes followed his. "Yes," she said, "if he could have seen all that would come of the task he gave me, he would have been sorry. I hope he does not see me now. I hope that he is among the old people of his blood and country, and that tidings do not reach him from the New World." Part 3, Winter Memories. Part 3, Chapter 1. Winter has settled down over the divide again, the season in which nature recuperates, in which she sinks to sleep between the fruitfulness of autumn and the passion of spring. The birds have gone. The teeming life that goes on down in the long grass is exterminated. The prairie dog keeps his hole. The rabbits run shivering from one frozen garden patch to another, and are hard put to it to find frost-bitten cabbage stalks. At night the coyotes roam the wintry waste, howling for food. The variegated fields are all one color now. The pastures, the stubble, the roads, the sky are the same leaden gray. The hedgerows and trees are scarcely perceptible against the bare earth, whose slaty hue they have taken on. The ground is frozen so hard that it bruises the foot to walk in the roads or in the plowed fields. It is like an iron country, and the spirit is oppressed by its rigor and melancholy. One could easily believe that in that dead landscape the germs of life and fruitfulness were extinct forever. Alexandra has settled back into her old routine. There are weekly letters from Emil. Lou and Oscar she has not seen since Carl went away. To avoid awkward encounters in the presence of curious spectators, she has stopped going to the Norwegian church and drives up to the Reformed church at Hanover, or goes with Marie Shibata to the Catholic church, locally known as the French church. She has not told Marie about Carl or her differences with her brothers. She was never very communicative about her own affairs, and when she came to the point, an instinct told her that about such things she and Marie would not understand one another. Old Mrs. Lee had been afraid that family misunderstandings might deprive her of her yearly visit to Alexandra. But on the first day of December, Alexandra telephoned Annie that tomorrow she would send Ivor over for her mother, and the next day the old lady arrived with her bundles. For 12 years Mrs. Lee had always entered Alexandra's sitting room with the same exclamation, "Now we be just alike old times." She enjoyed the liberty Alexandra gave her, and hearing her own language about her all day long. Here she could wear her nightcap and sleep with all her windows shut, listen to Ivor reading the Bible. And here she could run about among the stables in a pair of Emil's old boots. Though she was bent almost double, she was as spry as a gopher. Her face was as brown as if it had been varnished, and as full of wrinkles as a washerwoman's hands. She had 3 jolly old teeth left in the front of her mouth, and when she grinned she looked very knowing, as if when you found out how to take it, life wasn't half bad. While she and Alexandra patched and pieced and quilted, she talked incessantly about stories she read in a Swedish family paper, telling the plots in great detail, or about her life on a dairy farm in Gotland when she was a girl. Sometimes she forgot which were the printed stories and which were the real stories. It all seemed so far away. She loved to take a little brandy, with hot water and sugar, before she went to bed, and Alexandra always had it ready for her. "It sends good dreams," she would say with a twinkle in her eye. When Mrs. Lee had been with Alexandra for a week, Marie Shabata telephoned one morning to say that Frank had gone to town for the day, and she would like them to come over for coffee in the afternoon. Mrs. Lee hurried to wash out and iron her new cross-stitched apron, which she had finished only the night before. A checked gingham apron worked with a design 10 inches broad across the bottom. A hunting scene, with fir trees and a stag and dogs and huntsmen. Mrs. Lee was firm with herself at dinner, and refused a second helping of apple dumplings. I save up," she said with a giggle. At 2:00 in the afternoon, Alexandra's cart drove up to the Shabatas' gate, and Marie saw Mrs. Lee's red shawl come bobbing up the path. She ran to the door and pulled the old woman into the house with a hug, helping her to take off her wraps while Alexandra blanketed the horse outside. Mrs. Lee had put on her best black satin dress. She abominated woolen stuffs, even in winter, and a crocheted collar, fastened with a big pale gold pin containing faded daguerreotypes of her father and mother. She had not worn her apron for fear of rumpling it, and now she shook it out and tied it round her waist with a conscious air. Marie drew back and threw up her hands, exclaiming, "Oh, what a beauty! I've never seen this one before, have I, Mrs. Lee?" The old woman giggled and ducked her head. "No, just last night I met Ake. See dis tread vera strong, no wash out, no fade. My sister sent from Sweden. I used to ta-ank you like dis." Marie ran to the door again. "Come in, Alexandra. I have been looking at Mrs. Lee's apron. Do stop on your way home and show it to Mrs. Hiller. She's crazy about cross-stitch." While Alexandra removed her hat and veil, Mrs. Lee went out to the kitchen and settled herself in a wooden rocking chair by the stove, looking with great interest at the table, set for 3, with a white cloth and a pot of pink geraniums in the middle. "My aunt, you gotta find plants such a much flower. How you keep from freeze?" She pointed to the window shelves, full of blooming fuchsias and geraniums. "I keep the fire all night, Mrs. Lee, and when it's very cold I put them all on the table, in the middle of the room. Other nights I only put newspapers behind them. Frank laughs at me for fussing, but when they don't bloom he says, 'What's the matter with the darned things?' What do you hear from Carl, Alexandra? He got to Dawson before the river froze, and now I suppose I won't hear any more until spring. Before he left California he sent me a box of orange flowers, but they didn't keep very well. I have brought a bunch of Emil's letters for you." Alexandra came out from the sitting room and pinched Marie's cheek playfully. "You don't look as if the weather ever froze you up. Never have colds, do you? That's a good girl." She had dark red cheeks like this when she was a little girl, Mrs. Lee. She looked like some queer foreign kind of a doll. "I've never forgot the first time I saw you in Meiklejohn's store, Marie, the time father was lying sick. Carl and I were talking about that before he went away. I remember, and Emil had his kitten along. When are you going to send Emil's Christmas box?" "It ought to have gone before this. I'll have to send it by mail now to get it there in time." Marie pulled a dark purple silk necktie from her work basket. "I knit this for him. It's a good color, don't you think? Will you please put it in with your things and tell him it's from me, to wear when he goes serenading?" Alexandra laughed. "I don't believe he goes serenading much. He says in one letter that the Mexican ladies are said to be very beautiful, but that don't seem to me very warm praise." Marie tossed her head. "Emil can't fool me. If he's bought a guitar he goes serenading. Who wouldn't, with all those Spanish girls dropping flowers down from their windows? I'd sing to them every night, wouldn't you, Mrs. Lee?" The old lady chuckled. Her eyes lit up as Marie bent down and opened the oven door. A delicious hot fragrance blew out into the tidy kitchen. My, something smell good. She turned to Alexandra with a wink, her 3 yellow teeth making a brave show. I ain't dat stop my yaw from ache no more, she said contentedly. Marie took out a pan of delicate little rolls, stuffed with stewed apricots, and began to dust them over with powdered sugar. I hope you'll like these, Mrs. Lee, Alexandra does. The Bohemians always like them with their coffee. But if you don't, I have a coffee cake with nuts and poppy seeds. Alexandra, will you get the cream jug? I put it in the window to keep cool. The Bohemians, said Alexandra, as they drew up to the table, certainly know how to make more kinds of bread than any other people in the world. Old Mrs. Hiller told me once at the church supper that she could make 7 kinds of fancy bread, but Marie could make a dozen. Mrs. Lee held up one of the apricot rolls between her brown thumb and forefinger and weighed it critically. Yes, like a fetters, she pronounced with satisfaction. My, ain't dis nice, she exclaimed as she stirred her coffee. I just ta ache a little yelly now too, I ta ain't. Alexandra and Marie laughed at her forehandedness and fell to talking of their own affairs. I was afraid you had a cold when I talked to you over the telephone the other night, Marie. What was the matter? Had you been crying? Maybe I had, Marie smiled guiltily. Frank was out late that night. Don't you get lonely sometimes in the winter when everybody has gone away? I thought it was something like that. If I hadn't had company, I'd have run over to see for myself. If you get downhearted, what will become of the rest of us? Alexandra asked. I don't very often. There's Mrs. Lee without any coffee. Later, when Mrs. Lee declared that her powers were spent, Marie and Alexandra went upstairs to look for some crochet patterns the old lady wanted to borrow. Better put on your coat, Alexandra. It's cold up there and I have no idea where those patterns are. I may have to look through my old trunks. Marie caught up a shawl and opened the stair door, running up the steps ahead of her guest. While I go through the bureau drawers, you might look in those hat boxes on the closet shelf, over where Frank's clothes hang. There are a lot of odds and ends in them. She began tossing over the contents of the drawers and Alexandra went into the clothes closet. Presently she came back, holding a slender elastic yellow stick in her hand. What in the world is this, Marie? You don't mean to tell me Frank ever carried such a thing? Marie blinked at it with astonishment and sat down on the floor. Where did you find it? I didn't know he had kept it. I haven't seen it for years. It really is a cane, then. Yes, one he brought from the old country. He used to carry it when I first knew him. Isn't it foolish? Poor Frank. Alexandra twirled the stick in her fingers and laughed. He must have looked funny. Marie was thoughtful. No, he didn't, really. It didn't seem out of place. He used to be awfully gay like that when he was a young man. I guess people always get what's hardest for them, Alexandra. Marie gathered the shawl closer about her and still looked hard at the cane. Frank would be all right in the right place, she said reflectively. He ought to have a different kind of wife, for one thing. Do you know, Alexandra, I could pick out exactly the right sort of woman for Frank now. The trouble is you almost have to marry a man before you can find out the sort of wife he needs. And usually it's exactly the sort you are not. Then what are you going to do about it? She asked candidly. Alexandra confessed she didn't know. However, she added, it seems to me that you get along with Frank about as well as any woman I've ever seen or heard of could. Marie shook her head, pursing her lips and blowing her warm breath softly out into the frosty air. No, I was spoiled at home. I like my own way, and I have a quick tongue. When Frank brags, I say sharp things, and he never forgets. He goes over and over it in his mind. I can feel him. Then I'm too giddy. Frank's wife ought to be timid, and she ought not to care about another living thing in the world but just Frank. I didn't when I married him, but I suppose I was too young to stay like that, Marie sighed. Alexandra had never heard Marie speak so frankly about her husband before, and she felt that it was wiser not to encourage her. No good, she reasoned, ever came from talking about such things, and while Marie was thinking aloud, Alexandra had been steadily searching the hat boxes. Aren't these the patterns, Maria? Maria sprang up from the floor. Sure enough, we were looking for patterns, weren't we? I'd forgot about everything but Frank's other wife. I'll put that away. She poked the cane behind Frank's Sunday clothes, and though she laughed, Alexandra saw there were tears in her eyes. When they went back to the kitchen, the snow had begun to fall, and Marie's visitors thought they must be getting home. She went out to the cart with them and tucked the robes about old Mrs. Lee while Alexandra took the blanket off her horse. As they drove away, Marie turned and went slowly back to the house. She took up the package of letters Alexandra had brought, but she did not read them. She turned them over and looked at the foreign stamps, and then sat watching the flying snow while the dusk deepened in the kitchen, and the stove sent out a red glow. Marie knew perfectly well that Emil's letters were written more for her than for Alexandra. They were not the sort of letters that a young man writes to his sister. They were both more personal and more painstaking, full of descriptions of the gay life in the old Mexican capital in the days when the strong hand of Porfirio Diaz was still strong. He told about bullfights and cockfights, churches and fiestas, the flower markets and the fountains, the music and dancing, the people of all nations he met in the Italian restaurants on San Francisco Street. In short, they were the kind of letters a young man writes to a woman when he wishes himself and his life to seem interesting to her, when he wishes to enlist her imagination in his behalf. Marie, when she was alone or when she sat sewing in the evening, often thought about what it must be like down there where Emil was, where there were flowers and street bands everywhere, and carriages rattling up and down, and where there was a little blind boot black in front of the cathedral, who could play any tune you asked for by dropping the lids of blacking boxes on the stone steps. When everything is done and over for one at 23, it is pleasant to let the mind wander forth and follow a young adventurer who has life before him. And if it had not been for me, she thought, Frank might still be free like that, and having a good time making people admire him. Poor Frank, getting married wasn't very good for him either. I'm afraid I do set people against him, as he says. I seem somehow to give him away all the time. Perhaps he would try to be agreeable to people again, if I were not around. It seems as if I always make him just as bad as he can be. Later in the winter, Alexandra looked back upon that afternoon as the last satisfactory visit she had had with Marie. After that day, the younger woman seemed to shrink more and more into herself. When she was with Alexandra, she was not spontaneous and frank as she used to be. She seemed to be brooding over something and holding something back. The weather had a good deal to do with their seeing less of each other than usual. There had not been such snowstorms in 20 years, and the path across the fields was drifted deep from Christmas until March. When the two neighbors went to see each other, they had to go round by the wagon road, which was twice as far. They telephoned each other almost every night, though in January there was a stretch of 3 weeks when the wires were down, and when the postman did not come at all. Marie often ran in to see her nearest neighbor, old Mrs. Hiller, who was crippled with rheumatism, and had only her son, the lame shoemaker, to take care of her, and she went to the French church, whatever the weather. She was a sincerely devout girl. She prayed for herself and for Frank, and for Emil, among the temptations of that gay, corrupt old city. She found more comfort in the church that winter than ever before. It seemed to come closer to her, and to fill an emptiness that ached in her heart. She tried to be patient with her husband. He and his hired man usually played California Jack in the evening. Marie sat sewing or crocheting and tried to take a friendly interest in the game, but she was always thinking about the wide fields outside, where the snow was drifting over the fences, and about the orchard, where the snow was falling and packing, crust over crust. When she went out into the dark kitchen to fix her plants for the night, she used to stand by the window and look out at the white fields or watch the currents of snow whirling over the orchard. She seemed to feel the weight of all the snow that lay down there. The branches had become so hard that they wounded your hand if you but tried to break a twig. And yet, down under the frozen crusts, at the roots of the trees, the secret of life was still safe, warm as the blood in one's heart, and the spring would come again. Oh, it would come again. This concludes the 4th part of 6 total of O Pioneers by Willa Cather, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.